hope we're ready to look at a fun passage because tonight is rather fun. 14 of 1 Corinthians, verse 26. Part of it I had referenced last week, so some of it I'll go through a little bit quicker, the regular order of a service, but the part that we'll spend most of the time is when Paul begins to speak about women. This is can be a famous passage, depending upon maybe what your denominational background is. It's one that I've been pretty familiar with. Anytime women was discussed and having anything to do with church, this is a passage that's usually mentioned to silence women. Here we go. Paul says, "What then, brothers, when one come together, each one has a hymn, a lesson, revelation, tongue, or an interpretation. Let all things be done for building up. If any speak in tongue, let there be only two, or at most three, and each in turn, and let someone interpret. But if there is no one to interpret, let each of them keep silent in church and speak to himself and God. Let 2 or 3 prophets speak, and let the others weigh what is said. If a revelation is made to another sitting there, let the first be silent. For you can all prophesy one by one, so that you all may learn and all be encouraged. And the spirits of prophets are subject to prophets. For God is not a God of confusion, but of peace, as in all the churches of the saints. The women should keep silent in the churches, for they are not permitted to speak, but should be in submission, as the law also says. If there is anything they desire to learn, let them ask their husbands at home, for it is shameful for a woman to speak in church. Or was it from you that the word of God came, or are you the only ones it has reached? If anyone thinks that he is a prophet or spiritual, he should acknowledge the things I am writing to you are a command of the Lord. If anyone does not recognize this, he is not recognized. So, my brothers, earnestly desire to prophesy, and do not forbid speaking in tongues. But all things should be done decently and in order." That's a good capstone for the rest of that section. All things should be done decently and in working order. Now, at the main section we'll look at, and how Paul writes about women's roles here in the church, it's not as simple as just saying, okay, well, that was then. There's a cultural difference, something we don't understand, and so let's just go across it. Let's just ignore it. It's not as simple as that. And I would hope we would never treat any passage really like that. Just because there's a variance in time, a big variance of time between theirs and ours, I would hope that at least there's something that we could do to build that bridge. Something that we can do to really help us for application, understanding it for what it meant for them, and also what does it mean for us. Problem is, when some people get to this passage, that's exactly what they do. Either some go to the extreme of not looking at anything internally within the package of this passage, just picking that one phrase out, well, women should be silent, and then slap that on and say, okay, well, then they shouldn't speak at all. The other side of that is to say that, well, this is just something that they did, we don't really understand it, so let's just throw it out. Both sides are in the wrong here, and I'm glad that the Apostle Peter said in the 3rd chapter of his 2nd letter, verses 15 and 16, that Paul wrote some things that were difficult to understand. This is difficult to understand. This touches on a little bit, if you can remember way back in chapter 11, Paul spoke a little bit about women and head coverings, and that kind of bleeds over into this a little bit. But this is a little bit tougher, because Paul mentions several things that are at play. He mentions the law. Well, what's he mean? He mentions also, he just got done talking about orderly service. And then he mentions husband and wives. There's a lot of things at play. So we have to pay close attention to that. But before we get directly to that, we have to look at the order that Paul gives this in. Spiritual gifts are to be practiced with order. So if someone has a tongue or a word or revelation, there should be someone to interpret that word or that revelation that's given to him in a tongue. And then also there should be, at most, Paul says 2 or 3. So there is to be an order to this. you can gather that the Corinthians were used to utter chaos. If you've gone to some churches before, or maybe you're not used to it, the difference between some services as a low church and a high church. If you've ever been to a high church service, that's like Catholicism, that's Episcopalian, that's Anglican, things like that. So a very high service is extremely structured, and you know exactly what's going to happen because the order goes according to the common book of prayer. A low church service is pretty much the people just decide how it's going to go, and it's very different. Pentecostals are always low church service, and depending upon your background, you could kind of go from first time I ever attended. I've never attended a Catholic service, but I attended a Catholic wedding, and that was different for me because I've never been accustomed to high church services, and it was just very different. Incense burning and everything going on, like a 2-hour wedding service, and I'm like, man, this is different. I'm used to, well, at the time, I was used to Baptist churches, and the only thing that lasted 2 hours was eating, at the buffet table for Baptist churches, and that was different. But here, Paul wants them to have some sort of order, to 2 or 3 at the most, giving a word. And he mentioned something interesting. He says that if there's 3 prophets there, and if one gets a revelation while one's speaking, he says that other one should stop speaking, and the one that immediately got the revelation should be speaking. It sounds a little rude on our part, but on Paul's, apparently it made sense in their Corinthian way of doing church service. And still, it had a level of order to it. Paul wanted to remind them that God is not a God of confusion, but that God is a God of order. And it's interesting here how Paul equates confusion to be the opposite of peace. If I was thinking of a word to make the opposite of chaos or confusion, well, I would use orderly a lot. Paul mentions here that the God is not the God of confusion. He doesn't say, though, that he's the God of order. He says he's the God of peace. He equates it, and then he actually flips it on its head. He doesn't say that God's the God of order, but that God's the God of peace. The opposite of peace is chaos. And that's what the Corinthians were apparently doing in their worship services. Orderly worship consisted of the gift of prophecy, gift of tongues, everything going on here. And it seems as though the Corinthians were just one wild service. And maybe some of the people really liked that. Maybe some people thought that Paul was just being legalistic and he was just trying to, he's a little nitpicky and he likes times to be right. And he just had this tight way of doing church services. But his main concern was it was just utter chaos, and you had so many people there that wasn't being edified. That was the real problem. Because Paul said, if you had all this chaos going on, you don't have people being edified. And that was his main concern within a church service. So he said, number 1, God should be glorified, and number 2, people should be edified throughout this. And there's a testing of the prophetic words that he gives. So we keep this Berean attitude. Remember the Bereans in Acts chapter 17 when Paul goes to the synagogue and preaches Jesus to them. They don't just take Paul's word for it. And Paul isn't offended either. He doesn't say, well, you ignorant Bereans, why don't you just accept my word? I'm an apostle. But he actually commends them because they search their Old Testament scriptures daily to see whether what Paul is saying is true or not. And they're commended for that. That's something that all Christians are called to. The 21st century church is in desperate need of that type of mindset, of knowing the scriptures well enough. That's the first thing you have to do. You have to know it well enough, and then everything that goes out from every sort of teaching is always sifted through what the Bible says. Does the prophetic word build up? And is the prophetic word loving? Those were the 2 criteria that Paul gave for it. Now, he gets into the women of the church. And there's a number of ways to go about this. There's no short answer to this. That's the thing that makes it very difficult, because there's no real short answer to just get to the bottom what is going on, because there's things that Paul says here that are cultural, and then there are also universal principles here, and it makes it difficult. So just reading it again a little bit, he mentions that the women should keep silent. The women should keep silent in the churches, for they are not permitted to speak. We have to go through the obvious first. Obviously, Paul is not prohibiting all women from ever speaking anything in church. Because, well, in chapter 11, he just said it's okay for women to pray and to prophesy if they have head coverings. If they have their head covered, that meant that they were doing a respectful time during their culture. and that they were okay then with prophesying and praying. Well, they may say, well, praying is not something that you do toward the church. Well, okay, maybe. But prophecy is. In fact, in this chapter, in chapter 14, verse 3, Paul says that prophecy is not given as a gift that you give back to God as if it's like the gift of tongues, but it's actually a gift that is horizontal in its nature. It's a gift that builds up, it's a gift that consoles, and it's a gift that edifies the church. So that's something that is done even from the woman. Obviously, Paul can't be saying that. I suppose there are some churches that would see it to that extreme. I think some of the Anabaptists would take it to that extreme. A woman is not allowed to speak at all, and she has to leave the building to speak. I think that's a little legalistic there, getting over as long as you cross the edge of the thing. But anyway. And then some people interpret these verses to mean that, this is the most common one, I think. Women should never be in any leadership capacities within the church realm. I remember particularly a church that I was at, and this was the subject. So what started this fire was a woman that was displeased with the Sunday school services. And so she thought, well, I'll make my own Sunday school class. So she did it, and some of the other men started noticing that their Sunday school classes were dwindling down. They had like 20, 30 people in their classes, and you had like 5 or 6 classes going on, and then all of a sudden people are starting to disappear. And then it turns out that they were going to hers. She was a much more engaging leader in public speaking and everything like that. She was a better teacher than they were. And they were very upset about it. So we had an impromptu meeting. We'll put it that way. That's a nice way to put it. Had an impromptu meeting on one Sunday night for 3 hours, screaming back and forth about this very verse. And I just asked the question. I said, so what is, if you take your thought to the extreme, then isn't that, how do you justify what Paul says in 1 Corinthians 11 with this, 1 Corinthians 14? That's basically swept under the rug and just, well, we don't do that anymore. So we'll just ignore it. And what this means is women can't teach men. That's what it means. I'm like, okay, well, Paul says that it's something from the law. Which law is he talking about? Is he saying that in a negative term? Or is he saying that in a positive term? Like, is he pointing this out just to show the folly of something? Because I thought we're not under law anymore. I thought we're under grace. I just wanted to kind of mess with them and throw some questions out there that really I didn't necessarily believe, but just to kind of mess them up. But we lasted for that long. It was what I called the 3-hour tour. You know, if you know, what is that? Is that Gilligan's Island or something? The 3-hour tour. That's what I always referred to it as.
You know, the shipwreck.
Yeah, that's exactly what it was. And it was just a mess, and it was basically that. So it went down to us talking about, and for an hour of, I said, so can women still lead children in Sunday school? Well, yeah, of course, they're children. I'm like, well, what about males? Oh, yeah, well, they're not men yet. And I said, okay, well, what does it take for them to become a man then? What age is that? Because we have some older men then in some of our Sunday school classes. Does that mean they should shoo away, just lock them out? And then some are more mature than others. What exactly, is it just a certain age? Or is it different for some, different for others? And that led to a whole other discussion about, well, it's just a certain age. When they reach to it, they're no longer allowed to be a part of Sunday school. I just thought it was kind of, they were jealous because they were getting a lot more people. She was getting a lot more people in her Sunday school class than they were. And there's, yeah, there's a lot of jealousy. But this, every time I look at this passage, I can't help but think that. And some of the justification comes right back out because this is what's mainly used. It means that for them, they would see it as, this means that no women could ever have a church leadership capacity or role. So they would take it with 1 Timothy chapter 2, which I'm not going to get in 1 Timothy 2 because that would take an extremely long time. But they would take it with 1 Timothy 2 and then mold that with this and then use that as the defining way to interpret this passage. They would take Paul's statement that women should be silent, meaning that a woman should never be teaching a man, and any leadership role, I actually had one woman who, at this women's Bible study, I wanted to sit on, and at the time, all this uproar was going on. She said, I was like, oh, this looks like a really good Bible study. Can I come to it? And she was like, yeah, sure. It was only women at the time who would come to it, but eventually she closed me out to it. She said I couldn't come to it. She said if I wanted to sit in the audio booth, I could do that and kind of secretly kind of be a part of it. I said, no, that's okay. I'll just look up the videos myself on YouTube. That's okay. There's no way, though, to reconcile this with Paul's statement, 1 Corinthians 11. I don't think. But we'll go a little bit further. I think it's very hard to justify a lot of the other things that you see in the Old Testament and the New Testament with what women is doing. Now, the two sides of this would be complementarianism, is the theological term for it, which means that men and women are created equal, but men have different positions in the church and different roles in the family than women do. The other side would be egalitarianism, which believes that they have equal rights within the church, within the role. But even within those two positions, you have 1 and 2 point egalitarians and 1 and 2 point complementarians. Egalitarian is not the term that they would refer to themselves, which I am one after years of study, but it took a while to get to that because I was a complementarian for so long. The real technical term was hierarchical complementarianism or non-hierarchical complementarianism, but the term egalitarianism just kind of got slapped on me. But examining the Bible a little bit, there's some people that I've never heard quite what a complementarian would do. For instance, you have Phoebe in Romans chapter 16. Phoebe is described as a deaconess, and she hand delivers the letter of Romans to, Romans, that Paul wrote. The thing is when someone delivers a letter, it's not as simple as just, well, here you go. Just giving someone a letter and then leaving. Bye, everyone. I'll see you all later. It's not that simple. Phoebe, as a regular part of the service, Phoebe would be leading the service, and she'd be saying, St. Paul says this. She would read it, and all of its 16 chapters, although it wasn't divided by 16 chapters then. You have that much later. And she would teach from it. She would exegete it. So if anyone had any questions, the regular custom of someone sending a letter, and you have this proof in the Greco-Roman world, no one just sends a letter and hands it to them. They always explain it too. So the thing that's amazing to me is the second person that has the best theology of Romans. Romans is a hard book. I mean, if anyone says it's an easy book, let's walk through 9, 10, 11 and try and work that throughout the rest of the book. It's very hard. It's a difficult book. Phoebe had the second best theology of it, second to Paul, because obviously Paul wrote it. But she would have explained all of those questions. You know, people would have had questions about, I have a lot of questions about Romans 11. And Phoebe would have had to explain it and exegete it and teach it. That's different. You have certain people of women having roles within the early church. You have Mary, the mother of Jesus, Mary, the sister of Martha and Lazarus. And when Mary is sitting, so when Jesus is at their house and, Martha is going all over here and there, and Jesus tells her, Martha, Martha, that Mary has chosen the true thing. And she's upset with her sister. Rebuke my sister. She's just sitting at your feet. But the gospel writer says that she's sitting at the feet of Jesus, which is a disciple term. It doesn't mean that she's just sitting at Jesus' feet, just oohing and awing over him, and isn't he such a great teacher and everything. She's learning from him, so that way she becomes a teacher too. That was the whole point. You use that type of terminology in any Jewish terminology, they know exactly what it means. It doesn't mean just someone's just soaking in the teaching. It means they're soaking in the teaching for themselves to be a teacher. So I can't help but think that Mary was also a leader in a church somewhere down the road too. You have Priscilla, Lydia, Lois and Eunice in 2 Timothy, Euodia and Syntyche in Philippians chapter 4. You have women of high standing and leadership in Acts 13:50 and 17:4. What about the female apostle Junia in Romans 16:7? For the longest time, that word in Romans 16:7, it refers to two apostles. One of them is Junia, which is a feminine term. but it has been translated for so long in the masculine, junius. I don't want to assume that there's mishandling there. There's a prejudice there. We can't have a female apostle, so even though I see that this is feminine, we'll just change it to masculine. I don't want to assume that. So maybe there's something that was going on there, but even the church fathers, John Chrysostom, he mentions that Junia, out of all the apostles, he said how great it was to have the apostle Paul say you were the greatest among the apostles. Those two, their groups. Now, some translators translate it as Junia and the other apostle, the group, and it says they're well known among the apostles. That could be translated that way. Not too many scholars say anymore that that's probably the best way to translate it. The best way to understand it is that Junia was a female apostle. And for years, I think some translators just didn't like that term, and so they didn't translate it that way. Sometimes that translation can be a little bit dangerous because you can kind of have your own perspectives into it. Translation is always interpretation. There's no such thing as translation without interpretation. So you can always try to translate without your perspective. Sometimes it's hard, though. Sometimes it's hard with what happened with Romans for so long, chapter 16. So second, we can say that Paul is alluding to something different here than he is in chapter 11. Chapter 11, he's referring to a woman's service. So you have the female service over here, which the women could pray and prophesy in with their heads covered. But this is talking about the general assembly. And they can't do that here. They can't have anything that a man would learn from. A problem is, Paul mentions men in 1 Corinthians 11:2. The assumption there is there's both parties, there's both genders. There's not much evidence to support that. I don't know too many people that would, but I've seen a few. Third is that Paul is referring to a disturbance in the service. So the men and women are segregated. Men usually up front in a group, not with pews obviously because they didn't have that then. And women more in the back. And women at their time in the Greco-Roman world could mostly be a little uneducated. It's just the situation that they found themselves in life. And so you would have husband and wives. You would have wives as the teacher was speaking, as a leader of the time, or you have someone giving a prophecy or tongue, whatever. You could have women disturbing the service because they're asking their husband questions because the husbands would have been a little bit more educated in their society. And so Paul was saying, don't do that. That's disturbing the service. People can't, enjoy and hear and everything like that. There's that. There's a slight nuanced belief that says also that women were more in commerce. They were more in the economy then because they would go out to the marketplace quite a bit, the Greek marketplace, and they picked up certain dialects. You pick up certain Greek. Just because we say that it's Greek language doesn't mean anything. You have several different types of Greek languages. You have classical Greek, koinonia Greek, you have common place Greek like this. So they might have had their own type of language and they might have been talking within the service. And so Paul was saying, hey, don't do that, you're disturbing service. I held to that view for a while until I found it unsatisfactory. Because Paul mentions one thing in verse 33 that blows that apart. He begins verse 33, or he ends it, with saying that this is as in all the churches. It says, as in all the churches of the saints, the women should keep silent in the churches. So Paul's not giving something that's just specific to the Corinthians. He's giving something to, at the beginning there, it would be, could you go back to verse 33? That'd be okay. You've probably already been there. I was just yabbering away. Thank you. As in all of the churches of the saints. And then he goes on, the women should be silent. Well, so this isn't just the Corinthians. This is the Corinthians, Thessalonians, Philippi, Colossia, Laodiceans. This is everybody that Paul has ever had a hand in planting. This is a command for all of them. And then he gets at the end that this is the teaching of an apostle. If you don't recognize it, then you're not going to be recognized. And so this is a universal principle. So saying that this is something specific to Corinth or to around their area, it's hard because Paul makes that little statement there that this is universal for all churches, not just Corinth. Now, since Greek doesn't have apostrophe marks and commas and everything like that and periods, I haven't met anyone that would believe this, but I suppose you could connect those two, verse 33, and just make it one verse, stop, and then get to the rest. For God is not a God of confusion, but of peace, as in all the churches of the saints, period. I suppose you could say that, and then this would just be the women should keep silent in the churches. Problem with that is, though, it sure is clunky. It sure doesn't read well. And translating Koinonia Greek into English is kind of choppy sometimes, but that just doesn't have the same Pauline flow that the rest of his corpus does. It's bumpy. It's like, as in all the churches, God is a God of peace and not of confusion. Well, it's just been talking about the Corinthians and how their services are chaotic. So to take something specific like this chaos and then to say, well, this principle's for all the churches, it just doesn't quite make sense. I don't buy that either. The view that I do hold is that this is not necessarily a disturbance issue. This isn't a teaching issue. This is an issue between husband and wife. So whenever it's translated as man and woman here in this section, it's best translated as husband and wife, because that's the relationship that Paul has set around. He's fenced this in that relationship. Now, why is Paul's solution for the wives to ask their husbands at home? Because that's what he says. He says if there's a wife that doesn't understand, then she should go and ask her husband. It's shameful for a woman to speak in church. I like the English Standard Version, but it does kind of a choppy job there with translating. Okay, we're going to translate woman here, wife here, husband here, man here. It just doesn't flow as well as if translated all as husband and wife. Paul is prohibiting, I think, wives from verbally weighing or critiquing a husband's prophetic word, or another woman's husband's prophetic word. So at the beginning of this, he just got done talking about if there's prophets that speak, let the congregation weigh what is said. I think Paul here is saying you have to be careful when a wife is critiquing the prophetic word of a husband, because it may seem as disrespectful. In their time, in the Greco-Roman rhetoric language, it was very disrespectful to debate a husband in public. But it's even more disrespectful to debate another woman's husband. So if you were to have a man give a prophetic word in their corporate service, and then you have both parties are married, and then a woman gets up and starts critiquing him, and rather could be kind of abusively or saying whatever, Paul was prohibiting that. He says you need to take that home. Because, well, here Paul mentions that it's the relationship is husband and wife. He mentions the law in verse 34. Well, what law? He's probably referring to the marriage covenant in Genesis chapter 2. And then the context of the Greco-Roman world is it's very disrespectful for a wife to debate her husband or another woman's husband in public. And then it just makes so much sense in the context of judging prophetic words. For Paul to go to this, to automatically jump in, but I don't want women to have any leadership roles. I don't want her passing out the communion plate. I don't want her passing out this. I don't want her doing that. It just doesn't, why does Paul jump through these hoops when the topic is about using prophetic gifts? The topic is about using spiritual gifts. It just makes so much more sense looking at the entire context. So in finishing up, all men and women are gifted by the Spirit. It's not given to just one gender. It's given to both. It's given to males, and it's given to females. It's given to husbands, and it's given to wives. The Spirit distributes as the Spirit sees fit, according to the person. But he doesn't discriminate according, God's no respecter of persons. He doesn't see the men and he's like, oh, I'm really going to give them flashy gifts, and then sees the women, and some churches are run that way. And sees the women, and he's like, I'm going to pass over them. I don't care about them. No, both genders are given gifts. And we're both called by Scripture to use them for the building of the church. And ultimately, out of love for glory.